Okay, shall we start? Because it's 5 o'clock. Sorry, I'm a minute late. I was giving a lecture somewhere else. I'm very delighted to have this evening Dr. Ben Collier, who is a lecturer in digital methods at the School of Social and Political Science, University of Edinburgh. He also collaborates with the Cambridge Cybercrime Centre on, it's an interdisciplinary centre that combines expertise from computer science, technology, and law. He's interested in online communities that I've never heard of. They're an important side of that. But it's really nice to have someone who's not a criminologist, but who works with someone who is a criminologist, and is here to talk to us about a very interesting development. This talk is called Influencing Policing, Digital Nudges and Policing the Polycrisis with UK Preventative Law Enforcement. Delighted to have you here.
Good, thanks so much. Yes, I'm just going to check this works. No. Hello, so I'm Ben. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. So I'm here to talk to you a bit about some research I've been doing actually for quite a long time now, since about 2018. So it's something that originally started in Cambridge in the computer lab when I was teaching postdoc. But yeah, so this is the Influence Policing Project, and it's not just me, there's quite a few of us working on it. So we've also got James Stewart from Edinburgh, Lydia Wilson, who's at Cambridge, Shane Horgan at the University of Napier, and Jen Flynn and Daniel Thomas from the University of Strathclyde. So it's a weird sort of mix of people. We've got journalists, science and technology studies people, a few criminologists as well, and some techie people also. But you're probably wondering what on earth is influence policing? So, I'll give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. Essentially, influence policing is a phenomenon we found out about sort of 5 or 6 years ago when we were looking at cybercrime and law enforcement interventions in cybercrime. And we found this really weird thing. We found a single example of it. We decided to give it a name. And after we did that, we found loads and loads of other examples of it. And so we decided to turn it into a research project. So, concretely, influence policing, and this does sound a bit conspiratorial, but this is the way the police talk about it. Influence policing is, in a UK policing context, the use of domestic digital influence campaigns to achieve police strategic goals. So essentially using these sort of like techniques associated with Cambridge Analytica or disinformation campaigns, essentially using them to do preventative policing. So I'm going to explain what that looks like in practice, how it's organized, and some examples of it. So the first 3 bits are essentially background. So essentially this is a mix of 3 different phenomena, the first being social marketing and behavior, the second being behavior change science, and then the third being digital ad targeting. I'll then talk a bit about kind of how those 3 things come together, how they form influence policing, and sort of tie to a bit. Apologies if the discussion of the criminological literature is a little bit sort of basic, but I think it's quite good to sort of tie it into some of the classic stuff. I'll then talk about these 2 bits of fieldwork we've been doing over the last couple of years. So particularly, we had a really in-depth look at the Police Scotland Strategic Communications Team. So this is a dedicated team that Police Scotland has, the single national police force in Scotland, has to do exactly this. So these digital influence operations for preventative policing, and then we'll look at kind of wider UK landscapes, how different police forces in the UK do this sort of digital, strategic, targeted communications to change people's behaviour. And then we'll talk a bit about where all this is kind of going. So a little bit of a warning regarding the content of the talk. So there's no graphic images or things like that, but some of the content does touch on topics that are a bit grim and can be sort of triggering for people. So some of these campaigns, it tends to be the topics of the ad campaigns that are run, basically. But so some of these cover child abuse, exploitation. There's a particularly sort of unpleasant one run by the UK Home Office, targets asylum seekers making a crossing at Calais. There's also some stuff around drugs and alcohol, and some examples of kind of racist stuff as well. So just to make you aware of that. But to kick off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of this kind of police work. So, and particularly the history of something called social marketing. So this really emerges in the early 1970s. So essentially, with the boom in mass consumer culture, particularly kind of during and post 1960s, you see colossal amounts of money, expertise, talent, people, and ideas pouring into commercial marketing. This is people essentially trying to turn commercial marketing into a science to make people buy things, to sell consumer culture. And this marketing expertise then gets picked up by the state. Essentially, initially in health services decide, well, okay, there's all this essentially science, practice, tools for changing people's behavior, but we want to start marketing things that don't have a product or price associated with them. Particularly when they want to start marketing health preventative behaviors. So things like getting people to brush their teeth, getting people to eat healthier, getting people to attend a GP appointment if they have particular symptoms, etc. And they do this through essentially using the same techniques, tools, approaches, vectors that marketing is using at the same time. Now, you may see these, when people see these sort of things, they often think, well, isn't this the same as kind of traditional sort of what's often associated with the Soviet Union style kind of public propaganda? We say, one of my favorite ones that people always post on Twitter is an advert with the Cyrillic text saying, if you've washed your shirt in gasoline, don't hang it up by the fire. So this is quite distinctive to that. Whereas that kind of traditional propaganda tends to talk to audiences, constructs its audience based on either national identity or class identity. This doesn't do that. This instead constructs consumer audiences for essentially public sector goals. So it says, well, you know, marketing science is finding all these groups of people out there in the community, and we're going to try and target and tailor these communications to resonate rather than with, you know, member of the working class. Instead, well, okay, we want this communication to be something that people that watch EastEnders, for example, or people that buy this particular type of trainer might have it resonate. And this starts to develop into forms of segmentation. So essentially finding different groups, different markets in the public and tailoring your communications to them. I won't go too much into detail with this, but it shares links with these sorts of like essentially cybernetic ideas of government that are circulating in Britain in the 1970s in some sort of policy circles, where rather than sort of designing societies from the top down through these high modern sort of strategies, instead people are saying, well, you know, societies are pretty complex, and when we try to do this sort of design society stuff, it often seems to go quite badly. So this is the idea that, well, instead of doing that, we'll put these clever mechanisms into place, things like communication, aspects of social design, that don't try and sort of lock out society. Instead, they put these little, they call it sort of autopoiesis, these little feedback mechanisms that will encourage positive behaviors, encourage positive feedback loops, and discourage negative ones. So this really does start in health, but it moves quite quickly into policing as well. And you see, particularly in the 1980s, the rise of the police awareness campaign. Now, these are almost all initially focused on essentially changing the behavior of consumers to protect usually consumer products, so things like lock your doors and windows, lock your car, etc. Usually, and it's linked to sort of the Thatcherite social values of government at the time, often trying to get people to buy into a consumer market of security solutions. So things like buy a security camera for your business, buy a new security system, door locks, etc. for your house. And it's using these marketing techniques to try and encourage this. So that's the first bit, social marketing. The second thing that comes in then is this idea of behaviourist government. So across the 1990s, you see this real interest, particularly in the UK, of the idea of government, that you can govern like a science, essentially. That policy can be evaluated, it can be subject to experiments, we can test policy in different places, and we can apply essentially the logics of science evaluation to policy making. Now, this kind of continues throughout the Blair period and really gets to its apotheosis in nudge. So around the time of the financial crisis, Stahl and Sunstein published this book on what they call nudge government, essentially. And they essentially say the financial is, actually they do make the case that it is fairly linked to this huge 2007-8 financial crisis. Oh, we're going backwards. But they say, well, obviously government not intervening in things doesn't seem to be working too well for us, and clearly we need to do something. But they are actually still very keen not to tell people what to do. They're very keen on this idea of what they call libertarian paternalism. So essentially the government, in this rather contradictory fashion, can really have a big role in people's lives and shaping society, but people will be left alone to make their own choices. Again, this has really strong roots in sort of technocracy, cybernetics. The idea here is that government doesn't tell you what to do and doesn't really constrain your action. You're allowed to make your own choices fairly freely as to what to do. Instead, the idea here is that government reworks the choice environment, the environment in which you make your decisions. So it uses all sorts of like psychological science, particularly behavioral psychology, economic science, to analyze the environments in which people are making decisions around health, protective behaviors around crime, etc., and tweak little aspects, often economic aspects of this environment. So slightly increasing the prices of particular things that we don't want people to buy, slightly reducing the prices of things that we do want people to buy. Putting cigarettes at the back of the shop or using particular packaging for cigarettes to discourage people buying it. Now, as you can probably imagine, and this certainly I remember when this stuff came in particular around smoking, communications plays a big role here. So that means, for example, taking signals we don't want out of the communication environment. So particularly, there's a ban on billboard advertising for cigarettes. When I was growing up, we'd always see these huge, in Alloa, Lambert and Butler adverts everywhere. There's just not a feature of British social life anymore. And replacing those with signals that we do want. So you see this on cigarette packages, these sort of really graphic images of people with sort of cancer, things like this. And the role of communications here is to kind of align citizens with this wider set of nudge interventions. So they're often economic interventions as well. So combining these two together, you can see we have social marketing, the idea that you can use marketing, communications to shape people, to shape social life, to achieve policy aims, and behaviours government. The idea we can do this in a sort of quasi-scientific way by mobilising sort of economic behavioural science rationales. And so this is quite characteristic of, there was a lot of this stuff going on, particularly in the UK, in around 2012-13. This is then radically changed by the third aspect of influence government. And that is the rise of the platform economy, and particularly the rise of what's called surveillance capitalism. So up to this point, if you're targeting these sort of communications, you've got two options. You can either use the resources, the sort of estates you already have available as the government or as the public sector. So you can put adverts in police stations, you can put adverts in GP surgeries, in local council areas, or you can use the fairly basic traditional marketing ecosystem. So this tends to be postcode segmentation based on socioeconomic status, age, gender, ethnicity, location. But this hugely changes with the rise of social media and the business model, particularly of surveillance capitalism. So I'm probably familiar to you, but essentially at this point, social media sites and wider internet giants, so Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., start providing huge amounts of really transformative services to the public completely for free. This is starting to no longer be the case, but you don't have to pay to use Google, you don't have to pay to use Facebook, you don't have to pay to use Twitter. You certainly shouldn't pay to use Twitter. But the price that you pay for that service is not money, instead it's your data. So these services hoover up huge amounts of data, not only from what you do on their platform, they put cookies on your computer and they see what you're doing in the whole rest of the internet. So if you buy a particular brand of shoes, Facebook knows about it. If you read a particular book, Amazon knows about it. And they can use this now to create very, very sophisticated, detailed profiles of your online life, of your online behavior. So you've got all these behavioral tags now associated with you. So instead of simply saying, well, I want to target ABC1 men in this particular area of Liverpool, I can say, I want to target people that go to the University of Edinburgh, that wear this particular type of shoe, that read these books, that have this particular political alignment, that are interested in these sorts of things. And this gives us access to extremely sophisticated, very, very detailed forms of audience segmentation. It really changes how marketers basically reach particular audiences. So essentially what these platforms are doing is mediating access, initially to private companies for commercial marketing, to these huge surveillance networks. And they can use this to shape behavior. And as I said, kind of now this model is slightly starting to change, but the data aspect is fairly similar. So when you take these three things together, you get influence policing. So essentially now, if you're going to be doing police strategic communications, which is essentially what they call social marketing, For these behavior change campaigns, you can now use very, very targeted, very, very detailed profiles, particularly your online behavior, your location, things like this to target these messages and to tweet. This ties into a number of existing trends in policing that are external to the communications aspects of policing. So particularly the increasing prominence of behaviorism and behavioral science and behavioral psychology across policing, particularly in problem-oriented policing. And a wider, and this is particularly important in a UK context, a wider move in UK policing towards prevention and the wider influence actually of the prevent duty in UK policing. So we've seen when we speak to these people that are doing this kind of work, the police that are engaging in these sorts of campaigns, they're often citing the influence of the prevent and counter-radicalisation duty. In fact, a lot of these communications methods initially started within prevent. So specifically using police targeted communications as a counter-radicalisation tool. This involves sort of surveilling, mapping risk, and targeting interventions to particular risk segments. So this essentially, you can think of it as effectively an epidemiological rationality of policing that really does come straight from prevent into this kind of work. At this time as well, so we're talking now about sort of 2017-18, a lot of police forces in the UK are trying to digitalize their communications, they're trying to professionalize their communications, and they're trying to do these big digital change strategies in general. So really at this sort of point, 2017-2018, that you see police start to use these kinds of big digital targeted campaigns. So what do these actually look like? I'll talk a bit, we do actually get some examples of this eventually, don't worry. So yeah, essentially what we did was we were really interested in this. Initially, we found an NCA campaign. This is when I was working with Alice. So where we're looking at a particular type of cybercrime, and we saw it kind of gone down in the UK but over this 6-month period, but it had gone up everywhere else in the world. And we said, oh, well, that's really interesting. Let's speak to the National Crime Agency, see if they did anything at this point. And they said to us, oh, that's really exciting. That 6-month period is exactly when we were running a digital influence campaign. And so what this actually looks like in practice is, if you searched for this particular type of cybercrime service in Google, you would start getting these ads that said, by the way, that service is illegal. If you use it, you are going to go to, essentially, the NCA will arrest you. And so it's this type of like responsive digital nudge communication. We got quite excited about this. We thought, oh my goodness, this is really innovative, no one's using this. And then it turned out when we spoke to Police Scotland, they'd had this team kind of set up around about the same time. So Police Scotland actually has a dedicated team that does this. They call it the sort of strategic communications team. It's not huge, it's about 5 or 6 people. And it was set up in 2018. And it's really a legacy of the amalgamation of Police Scotland into a single police force and the sort of digital transformation they underwent at the same time. This kind of makes sense because if you have, I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not going to say it off the top of my head, but if you have 24 or so legacy police forces that all have their individual communications department, so for small areas like Glasgow, Edinburgh, Highlands police forces, when you amalgamate them all together, you're essentially combining all those communication resources, professionals together, and budgets. And that gives you the people and the money to do these kind of specialist projects. So they do start to build these specialist departments. And it's part of a wider push across the public sector to incorporate more of these sort of advanced strategic communication strategies. That comes from the Government Communication Service. So we interviewed the team. We spent quite a lot of time with them, did some sort of participant observation. They gave us access to a lot of documents. Actually, interestingly, Police Scotland were very open about doing this. They were, I think, they really wanted people to know they were doing it. I think it's all slightly underappreciated. But we did some case studies on some of the campaigns they've run. We're also, and I'll get into this, particularly interested in what these campaigns look like outside of Scotland, to see if there's any characteristic differences. So we approached the Home Office, and the Home Office said, effectively, get lost. We're not going to talk to you about that. So instead, we wrote to Meta, the parent company for Facebook, and we said, God, we'd love to see some of these police campaigns that are being run through Facebook and targeted, get the targeting behind them, all that sort of thing. And so Meta said, yeah, sure, here you go. And so they gave us loads, I think 16,000 ads, including basically all the ads run by every UK police force, a bunch of ads run by security services, counter-terror police, etc. And so what follows will be a kind of discussion of some of that data as well. But I'll speak about Police Scotland first. So when we spoke to Police Scotland's strategic communications team, we're really interested in how this shift had happened, because a lot of the policing literature on digital communications by police focuses on this sort of PR form of policing. So it's like very commonly like photographs of the police with a police dog, like an Alsatian or whatever, trying to manicure the image of the police. But this was something quite different. And this was something that they felt very strongly as well. And in fact, they kind of, a member of their team said, well, you know, we really wanted to move away from PR work almost entirely, and instead do a small number of national, so 3 or 4 per year, of nationally focused campaigns that directly try to achieve key strategic police goals for that year. So if one of the police strategic goals for that year is let's tackle fraud, or let's tackle child abuse, online stuff. The goal of the communications team here was to try and make a tangible process that could be directly attributed to them on these key kind of strategic police issues. So how they actually did that is quite interesting. They were really keen specifically to move away from this. So to move away from relying on the authority of police, which they felt had characterized previous forms of police communication. So essentially, a picture of a cop telling you don't do that. And to move away from things like awareness campaigns, awareness messaging, because someone actually said to me, you know, you can't measure whether you've raised awareness or not. And instead to try to use these nudge techniques to directly shape the public's behavior. The framework, I won't go into too much detail, they use this thing called the COM-B framework, which is essentially a classic practitioner behavior science framework. It is effectively sort of routine activities theory for practitioners. It says that people change their behavior when they have the capacity to do so, the opportunity to do so, and the motivation to do so. So it's a classic criminology fans there. And they really wanted to move to kind of take advantage of the affordances of the new digital platforms. And interesting, and this doesn't really come from the behavior change science stuff. This really comes from a sort of, essentially a moral values decision made by this team. They were really keen to move away from responsibilizing the victims and survivors of crime. So they had a fair amount of pressure internally to do victim and survivor focused communications. So encourage people to take protective behaviors. But they said, well, actually, it's not particularly fair. And this was particularly in the context of gender-based violence. They said, we really want to move away from that. We really want all of our campaigns, or as many as possible, to be focused on the likely perpetrators of crime and to try and nudge their behavior rather than trying to nudge the behavior of victims and survivors. So I won't go into a huge amount of detail on how the campaigns are developed, but we think it was really interesting. So essentially, the initial stage as a strategic priority is identified, that's by senior police leadership. They then speak to the Stratcoms team, so strategic communications team, and select a number of potential campaigns. And what's interesting here is they don't actually say, well, we want you to do a campaign on this, or we want you to do a campaign encouraging this. Instead, they just give you a broad strategic area. And then the Stratcoms team goes off and does a full insights research process that synthesizes a lot of different types of research data that comes from different places. So they use police data, so direct data out of the police national computer, where they're building up these sort of profiles of like offenders, of particular sort of crime situations, opportunity profiles. They also go into the academic literature, they try and build psychological profiles of likely offenders, situational profiles. Weirdly, it is a bit of a grab bag, so they try and pack loads of stuff in. We've seen some campaigns where they bring in feminist sociology, some campaigns where they bring in particular charitable sector partners. And once they've got this, they're actually initially not looking at particular groups. What they're looking at is drawing this behavioral map of a situation that they're trying to prevent and finding a single element of it, like one tiny bit of it that they can develop a communications nudge for. And I'll kind of show you what that looks like in a second. Once they've got this nudge, so this aspect of the situation they're trying to change the economic calculation within, that's kind of how they construct it. They then move on to a much more traditional marketing process where they look at a particular audience. So if you're trying to nudge the behavior of, for example, a young man who is a misogynist and is going to engage in gender-based violence, they'll then say, well, okay, who is this person? How old are they? What do they watch on television? What pubs do they drink at? What do they do for fun? What sort of stuff do they buy? What sort of books do they read? Etc. So this kind of traditional marketing process. I think it's really interesting that the police are doing this in itself, and then they kind of develop the creative for a campaign and go to delivery. So I'm going to show you, and this isn't my language, this is the language of the, this is some just sort of based from our case studies, but this is from a campaign targeting online grooming, and these are some of the different types of profiles that developed. So we've got here a kind of offender profile of different types of offender. We've got a sort of, this is another insights report, so again, this is more sort of psychological profiling. This is an insights report which is starting to get into like who could be the target audience of the campaign. So we can see this sort of aspects of ethnicity here, modus operandi, etc., and picking out particular groups. And this is where it kind of boils down into the nudge element. So essentially say, well, previous campaigns, they focus on child sexual abuse, child abuse, they said essentially they focused on trying to stimulate empathy for victims, but they draw from the psychological research they've done. They say, well, and actually interviews with convicted offenders in prison, they say, well, they're actually, it doesn't seem to work. The empathy campaigns we've been doing don't seem to work. Instead, what matters to people is the consequences of their own actions for themselves. And so they developed this campaign around this. One of the interesting things here is that they can actually try different creative strategies out. So you have 50 different campaigns, run them all at the same time and see which performs best. So this is what they did with this initial one, which is quite, as you can see, it's kind of focused on consequences. This would be delivered on Facebook. This didn't find it work particularly well. I think they found this one worked. But this then turned into this campaign. So this is the subsequent campaign they ran. This was a really old campaign, so you can see here this is much more modern. I think it incorporates a lot more visual nudge elements. So you can see here, this is a really characteristic feature of nudge advertising is the eyes, these really prominent staring eyes. Usually because there's been psychological research reports saying if you have eyes in something, people like eyes, and so they focus on the eyes and it'll make it more impactful. This campaign, they ran in two different waves. The first wave was targeting everyone, all young, well, sorry, not everyone, was targeting all men aged 25 to 35 in Scotland who were online late at night. And I was getting that in my Duolingo, in everywhere I went on the internet, it was following me around. They also targeted at people using particular terms on Twitter which had come out in their interviews with convicted offenders. So if you use these particular words, you start to see these adverts. Running those two campaigns at the same time obviously potentially has some potential to backfire. I actually spoke to people who'd seen this campaign and were worried that they were being targeted because of something we looked at online. So you can see again how it can kind of, there's a lot of ways it can backfire. So the actual targeting itself is really interesting. They use all sorts of different things. We've found one campaign by the Scottish VR Violence Reduction Unit that targeted individual, sort of 2 kilometres around individual hospitals. And that was a particularly interesting one. That was actually a navigator campaign, so targeting people who had recently been victimised by meth crime, because they assumed that these people are going to be high risk for then going on to commit knife-related offences. This was particularly interesting because they ran it in Glasgow and they ran it in Dundee around these particular hospitals, or I think possibly hospitals and police stations. The Glaswegian advert, if you walk through here, you'll get the ad, and the person has a Glaswegian accent. The Dundonian advert, the person had a Dundee accent. So there are a lot of interesting ways that these are sort of tailoring these creative strategies to the targeting as well. Essentially, the hypothesis there is that these are all elements you can make it that'll help it resonate with people. I won't go much into evaluation, but it's extremely hard, as you can imagine. There aren't really any tools you can use to figure out whether these things work, what their effects are. Basically, what it boils down to is views. So you can see, well, how many people saw it, how many people clicked on it, but it's extremely expensive to actually evaluate this kind of thing. And in general, having spoken to people that do this sort of work in counter-radicalisation, the cost of evaluating one of these behaviour change campaigns is usually more than the campaign itself, substantially more, because you have to do huge surveys, you have to take baselines, etc. So we don't really see. So they sort of claim these campaigns are behaviour change campaigns, but actually we don't really see a lot of behaviourism actually in terms of how the campaigns are really delivered. It's a lot more holistic. So this behaviour change strategy basically acts as this huge grab bag, the sort of framework, where they compile lots and lots of different stuff. Stuff coming from their charitable partners, stuff coming from random bits of research, a lot of just stuff from, they're all sort of career marketers, a lot of it's just sort of marketing science, gut feelings, things like this, and they pack it in to these campaigns that are nominally kind of behaviour change. What's interesting is this is a really different vision of what police online digital communications looks like from how we currently see it. Currently, we sort of, people doing this sort of research on criminology of police communication, is often depicted as sort of police are fairly hapless, they're sort of using these sort of broad brush Twitter campaigns with police dogs. But actually, this shows the police as quite sophisticated and authoritative cultural actors that are able to use these quite sophisticated techniques to really actually quite, say, impressive, but like potentially quite worrying, but like really actually stuff that you wouldn't really expect the police to have the capacity to do. So just to make sure we're time to talk about England. So this is where some of the more sort of grim campaigns come in, I should say. So the Met Ad Library, we looked at between, depending on when we did it, about 12 and 16,000 different adverts by police forces across the UK, but also a range of other bodies, including the Home Office, weirdly MI6, which I'll show you. All sorts of Crime Stoppers do a lot of this stuff for the police as well. A lot of it's done by PCCs, do a lot of this behaviour change messaging where local forces don't. But this is not just a Scottish thing, fortunately. It's being used across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Weirdly, it does seem to be a UK thing. This is not used really in America. It's not used really in Europe. It's not used really globally at all, apart from in the UK. We think that is the legacy of Prevent and the legacy of the Nudge Unit in UK governance. The one exception to this is it is used globally in counter-extremism. It is used globally there, which is, again, quite driven by the UK. So I am going to talk about these 6. Yes. So essentially, there's lots of different versions of this that you can see across the UK. Different forces tend to prefer different approaches, but we do see these 6 distinctive frameworks. And I'll go through them. Essentially, I'm using this as a bucket to talk about interesting case studies. But yeah, 6 really sort of rationalities behind these campaigns. So choice, risk, opportunity, community, coordination, and territory. So the first mode is choice. This is essentially using these sort of strategies, but really trying to use consumer choice, essentially. So like treating the police as something like Coca-Cola or Nike, like a big corporate brand, effectively. And a huge amount of this is about manicuring the brand and image of the police, these sort of big cultural campaigns. So this is a good example. So this was the Don't Be That Guy campaign. It was launched by Police Scotland. So this was, by a complete coincidence, released the week after Wayne Couzens was initially arrested. So Wayne Couzens, a serving police officer who abducted and killed a woman. And effectively, about 2 weeks after that, this campaign launched. They'd been developing for the previous year. Now, in this context, a lot of UK forces were doing messaging around gender-based violence in the aftermath of that. But there was a lot of media criticism around it. It tended to be sort of essentially marketing protective behaviours for women, often in a really sort of hapless way. This instead really stood out because it was a perpetrator-focused campaign. So this spoke specifically to young men, and specifically to young men who had peers that they were worried about their behaviour. And so it said, if you've got a friend who's doing this sort of stuff, don't just laugh along. If they're targeting really kind of upstream, sort of casual misogynist behaviours, and they basically gave people a bunch of tips on how to challenge this sort of stuff without provoking a like massive negative reaction. But a lot of this campaign was it's really about kind of mobilising the brand of the police and the brand of Police Scotland. And as you can see, there's a lot of really detailed targeting behind this, which you wouldn't know just seeing the campaign. So things like targeting people based on sexuality, so straight male adults across adult sites targeting in Scotland, and a lot of kind of Twitter targeting as well. This is then actually picked up by the UK government. So this is the Enough campaign. So this directly comes from the That Guy campaign. So this has been run by the Home Office. What's quite interesting here is you can see a feature of these sorts of campaigns. So we actually get from the meta ad library some data on audience size, who saw it, how much they spent, and impressions. So you can see here audience size, they're targeting men 16 to 39 in England. They're not really targeting much at all. Audience size more than 1 million, that makes sense. There's more than 1 million men aged 16 to 39 in England and Wales. Impressions, 4,000 to 5,000. And that is because the bigger your audience size, so the less targeting you use, paradoxically, the fewer people that see it. So when you have very, very hyper-targeted campaigns, they get shown to your audience a lot more. A lot more people see it, and they see it a lot more times. The reason for this is because there's a bidding process going on behind this. So it's kind of like you have to spend a lot more money to get your ad shown at the Super Bowl than to get your ad shown to just people that live in this particular area of Liverpool. So you just get more bang for your buck. So on the one hand, we've got these big sort of branding-based campaigns where police is being treated like a big commercial advertiser. The second mode we really see, and this is quite distinctive, is what we call campaigns focused on risk. So this is essentially directly taking the campaigns that were used in the prevent duty. Again, essentially, this is about taking the entire population and taking a public health approach to segmentation. So saying across the whole UK population, what are the different risk groups? What are the different risk categories? What different cofactors seem to increase or decrease risk? You draw up your risk groups and you target different interventions at different risk groups. So it really is a public health kind of approach. This campaign has 3 segments. First segment is targeting people who are in the far right, and this is a charity that's largely funded by the UK state. So this is clearly targeted at young men in the far right. So you can leave the far right, not easy, but here to help you. And you can see this is the targeting, so it's really quite detailed. So we can see here interests, Bet365, first-person shooter games, etc., etc. Exclude interests. So we want this stuff. We don't want people who've got any of these interests. And remember, these are all combined together at the same time. So we don't want people who are into feminism or RuPaul's Drag Race or Greenpeace. We do want people, and this is crucially not an interest, this is a behavior. So this is the platform sort of detecting you're engaging with stuff that's to do with soccer. And you see all these sort of locations. So essentially stacking all of these things together into a profile. That's the first segment. The second segment targets that person's mum. Seriously. So it's an Emerson or your mum is something involved in far right extremism. You can see here, Asda, fine gardening, cruises. And for some reason, this particular ad was targeted people in Wiltshire. I don't know why. And finally, this ad was targeted at people's dads. And you can really see how they're trying to do this is absolutely ridiculous. Set of categories. But yeah, so you can see here, we're on a Remembrance Day, we're French and patriotic. You can see people that like the Daily Express, Daily Mail, Frankie Boyle, Jason Manford, who got very annoyed about this when we launched the report. Excluding, what's interesting here is this is excluding a lot of like far right US interests. People again who like soccer, but this is the really interesting bit. These are a list of locations this ad is going to be shown in. So we've got some quite big places. Gloucester's relatively sizable. Some of these are tiny. So this is All Hallows, lit it up, and it's this like it's about 1,000 people live it, and half of it's a caravan site. Here, this is East Kirkby, which is about maybe 30 houses next to an RAF airbase. It's really astonishing. It is pretty astonishing. But when you basically factor all this together, you're looking at extremely detailed, sophisticated targeting being done by people acting on behalf of the UK state. This is the one that is, I think people do find very upsetting. It certainly upset me a lot when I found this. So we've got these ones that are based on risk. So that risk attaches to a person, set of risk categories that increase or decrease your risk of being involved in things that they're trying to stop. This instead is much more about situational. Essentially, this is the situational version of that. So situational crime prevention, effectively. So this is a Home Office advert targeting asylum seekers in Calais, and it's targeting. So it's cut off the top. It's targeting, I think, young men aged 18 to 65. But you can see they're clearly basically using proxies for ethnicity. Now, you're not allowed to target based on ethnicity or religion in Meta platform targeting options, but you can see here they're doing all this very detailed targeting. It's clearly meant to be a proxy for ethnicity and religion, and they're targeting in this series of very small towns in Belgium and France. And these were really, this is not the most shocking of these adverts. There were a lot of these that involved sort of pictures of dogs, pictures of military drones, text that says, if you try to cross, you'll be killed, etc. So it's pretty, really grim, and I think really quite unethical. This is sort of less to do with digital targeting. The next mode is what we call community. So this isn't specifically targeted advertising quite the same way, but this is using digital influencers. So a lot of these campaigns are paired up with the use of online influencers to kind of amplify the campaign. Now, those of you who've watched The Thick of It, remember there's an episode where they get Andy Murray in to do a fitness and health and fitness campaign. This isn't that. This is a much lower level of it, much closer to your actual peers, people in your kind of friend group, or kind of moderately famous, moderate people with sort of 20,000, 10,000 followers on Twitter. And you can see here, so partnering with strategic UK and Midland-based influencers, these influencers will provide WMP the opportunity to create awareness and generate positive sentiment around policing. So again, this is sort of starting to get in some, you can obviously see why they're doing this, but again, this is starting to get into some ethically dubious territory, particularly what the police paying local people in your neighbourhood to tell you how great they are. Again, so this is we'll get on to the last two now. So the second last one is coordination. So this model of campaign is really different to the previous ones. Instead of behavior change, this kind of stuff, instead of these sort of attempts to nudge, these are really traditional police campaigns. This is just come to our online event, there'll be some police leadership there, local council will be there, talk about hate crime, tell us kind of. That's a really sort of traditional form of police advertising. But crucially, it's trying to hit a particular audience that police feel they don't have good access to. They don't have actually good, they're not able to sort of get those people's attention. And it's, yeah, it's pretty shocking. It's using the platform essentially to reach these audiences that are very hard, the police are finding very hard to reach. So we can see that these are pretty clearly proxies for religion. And you can see that religion and ethnicity come up again and again and again in these examples. The reason I included this particular one is because of this, you can see this post-book targeting. This is quite shocking, I think. This is not an interest category. This isn't, I looked at a particular thing and the platform has attached a tag to me to say, Ben likes shoes. This is a sort of weird platform detected behavior. So this is essentially Facebook figuring out how often you engage with content online and saying, well, this person seems to engage with content, all content online, messaging their friends, clicking on things on Facebook, watching videos, seem to engage more often during Ramadan, which they're using as a behavioral proxy for religiously observant Muslims. So that, again, there's a lot of issues here about intrusiveness, privacy, and whether or not the police, the UK government, the state should be actually using this kind of online surveillance data. This is the MI6 campaign, which I've included just because I thought it was really weird that these campaigns are on this up on the Meta ad database. So this is a recruitment campaign targeting young Black Britons in particular areas of the UK, but we're interested in how they actually targeted it because you aren't able to target based on ethnicity on Facebook. So here we've got particular universities, but also very, very specific postcode segmentation. So we're like, there's a single Liverpool postcode. Why are they targeting LA too? So we looked at the census, and this yellow box is LA2. And you can see that in LA2, 67.6% of people are Black and Black British. So you can see there's all these different ways, whether it's interests, postcode, behavior, location, that you can get around these restrictions on things like ethnicity targeting, targeting based on religion. And finally, and it's the last example, I include this because it was, just very odd. So this is the final way that police are using these campaigns, and this is the projection of symbolic authority, essentially claiming territory using these campaigns. So this is sort of uses postcodes to carve out this very specific area of London, and there are hundreds of these, and they all target different areas of London, and they all say different stuff. And this comes from the policing crime survey. The policing attitude survey. And it's attempting to target particular things that people in that area have identified as things they want the police to do something about, things that are local issues. And they're essentially using this to project a sort of holographic police officer in those areas that comes up on your phone and says, oh yeah, that thing you worry about, don't sweat it, it's fine, we're on it. Whether or not they actually are doing any of this stuff, who knows? But yeah, so we think, just to round off, we think there is something kind of interesting here and new. As you can probably tell, we're sort of still figuring out some of the theoretical aspects, still figuring out what the framework looks like. But there's this very weird sort of melange of different modes of power, control, targeting, all sharing the information space. What we really see here is this isn't a sort of like top-down surveillance-y Machiavellian kind of thing. When you look at this in the round, it really just looks like everything's going wrong. The police are being sort of starved of funds after sort of more than a decade of austerity. They've not got really a lot of money left for kind of frontline policing. They're facing huge numbers of massive intersecting crises, trying to desperately do stuff about all of them. And a lot of these have this sort of online components of things like misinformation or misogyny or online radicalization. And so essentially what they've done is they've found these digital tools, they've picked them up, and they've used them to develop some really interesting cultural and behavioral interventions in the public. And it's, so essentially the coda to this is now being picked up more widely as a result of, hopefully not work we've done, but as a result of some work that police communicators have been doing. So there are some of these campaigns now starting to come out from Interpol, Europol, and some American agencies as well. But if you want to know more about it, we've got a full report on the Scottish Institute of Policing Research website. But yeah, thanks very much.